everyone. Before we get into this episode, we just wanted to jump in here real quick and correct a mistake that we made. In the introduction, we pronounced Mary's last name incorrectly. Her last name is Meador. Names are important, and we wanted to make sure to get Mary's right. Okay, on with the episode. Welcome back to Expert Instruction, the Teach by Design podcast, where we dive deeper into the research surrounding student behavior by talking with the people implementing these practices, where they work, and with the students they support. I'm Megan Cave.
I'm Danielle Triplett.
Well, here we go, buddy. It's another episode.
Yay.
We're closing in on the end of the year. We're in that home stretch.
Woohoo!
Oh, and we're back with another Mythbusters episode. You know, I don't think that we had planned to continue this myth busting past this current season, but I mean, y'all are out here listening to these episodes for real.
They are popular.
They're popular. So Danielle and I are going to put our little heads together and see if we can maybe keep these things coming at you in our next season.
Yes. So our myth today is this. There are some students skewing our school-wide data. This is the idea of, well, if we just removed those students from our data, it would look a whole lot better. And joining us in our conversation are Mary Meador and Rayann Silva. Rayann and Mary come to us from the University of Washington SMART Center. Rayann is a school mental health training coordinator, supporting districts and agencies to provide evidence-based strategies that foster social-emotional well-being for everyone. Mary Meador is an implementation coach. She works with schools to implement proactive systems of support. She brings with her a passion for systems change, fidelity of implementation, and culturally responsive PBIS and social emotional learning.
It was so great to talk with the two of them,
Yes.
don't you think?
Yes.
Yeah, Mary was the first one to jump in and remind us that when we talk about school-wide, we actually mean everybody. And that if we are to exclude anyone from that data, that if we exclude everyone from that definition, then we're actually removing those students' experiences from our decision making.
Yes.
It's a form of exclusion that we don't really talk about when we talk about data and school-wide decisions.
Yeah.
But
I loved how she pointed that out.
I did too. And then there was also a real focus on the systems that we put in place for our teams. That when there's some work that has to be done up front to make sure that we're all coming to the table with the same purpose. And we all have those roles to play.
Yep. I found myself nodding and smiling a lot and thinking from my own time as a coach with schools and knowing that, yes, so much of the work we do with our teams comes before the team actually comes together for that meeting to get ready for it.
That's so right. Yeah. They came to us with a lot of strategies, some good ideas for decisions, what is it? What is the word I'm looking for?
Decision-making systems.
Yes. So anyway, we hope that you guys enjoy the conversation as much as we did.
Yes.
Here we go.
Here you go. Listen in.
Well, Mary and Rayann, thanks so much for joining us today and being here to talk about this myth.
Thank you for having us. We're excited to be here.
Yeah, perfect. So you guys get to join us to discuss another myth, another common held assumption that we hear all the time from schools that are implementing this framework. When they're looking at their data, they see that their data for that month is looking a certain way, and they might notice that it's just a handful of students that are contributing to the referral patterns that they see. And so the assumption that they make is that some students are skewing our school-wide data. And so we just wanted to explore that a little bit with you. And maybe we'll just start by asking you, where do you think this myth or this assumption comes from? Why is it something that people often say or think about when we're talking about school-wide support and data?
Yeah, I am so excited to talk about this. I think there's actually a lot to unpack in it. So in my opinion, I think it stems from kind of this fallacy that schools are designed for some kids. We hear really similar narratives in like instruction, and we just removed these kids. Others would have more high quality access to instruction. I don't know. Unfortunately, I think we know which kids are often being talked about. It's typically are historically underrepresented and marginalized groups. Yet, like those same students flourish in other settings and environments. So why can't they in this specific one?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's because our data is a reflection of the environment and not necessarily student behavior. So how well can our environment support all students?
I think too that I'll just add, when I first started working in PBIS, I kept hearing the phrase all means all.
Yes.
And I think there's this lack of understanding of what that truly means. And when that resonated finally with me, I kind of understood like, this is why we wouldn't remove certain kids from our data, right? And I think that people do that with good intentions. But when we do that, essentially it's leading to exclusion, right? It's not the typical exclusion for behavior, but we're still excluding kids, and behind those data are actually human beings. Yeah. And we forget that sometimes. And I think that educators do this. Specifically, I'm thinking about a team that I've worked with before. And they say, when we're helping them pull their data, they say, well, can you remove these kids? Because our data would actually look really good. But these same kids keep popping up. And so we've had to have some tough conversations around that, because one, that leads to exclusion. Two, it means that whatever supports we're providing for those kids might not be working, and we might not be thinking about the function of their behavior when we're kind of matching them to supports. But I think some of the pressure around this can come from the district. So the district wants us to, there's a certain level of pressure, I guess, around accountability and data purposes, right? And so oftentimes when we have that level of pressure coming from the district level, sometimes it can be placed on educators without proper supports, like professional development and coaching supports, right? And when we lack the supports to help teams really understand why we need to be looking at all our data, and why it's not, like Rayann said, it's a reflection of our environment. And then obviously, I think communication of needs. And when we don't pair it with these types of supports, then essentially we end up letting kids slip through the education system without getting their needs met, right? Which leads to a whole bunch of different negative outcomes.
That's right.
Such a good point.
Yeah. Yep. So I think it's just pairing both supports with the accountability, because we want to have accountability on having good data, but behind the data are kids. So we want to make sure that their teams are getting support and educators are getting support to be able to support the kids. I just said support like 50 times.
That's okay.
we'll edit it. It'll sound perfect at the end. No worries.
I would add on that I think it's bigger than just the district, right? It's the accountability system in general. So the district is kind of just the conduit of the state's accountability system, the national accountability system. But when you remove the accountability piece of it, I think all educators went into the profession with a huge heart to support all students, to help all students achieve their aspirations. And when we look at data, it kind of brings up this cognitive dissonance in us. Like, I know I'm good. I know I have a good heart. I know I'm good at what I do, but these data don't show that. And so if we look at it and see that it's something outside of myself, then I don't feel so bad about maybe falling short, even though it's not about me falling short. As Mary mentioned, it's a symptom of our system that we can do something about.
I love that, Rayann. So let's think about this. If students, as you've said, right, they're not skewing our data, they are doing what they're supposed to do. What are kids doing then? How would we talk about this? How do you coach teams in terms of what does that mean when they see data and it's all the kids, all means all?
Yeah, so we've mentioned it a few times, but I think it's helping us to see what the gaps in our system are. And those gaps could be a number of things. The safe, supportive spaces for everybody, maybe educator burnout, high quality, relevant instruction, including social emotional learning, engagement strategies, student voice absent in the way that we design our school settings.
Yes.
And it could be telling us who needs additional support. So it could be a lot of things.
That's right.
I think it also could be telling us, and I'm not trying to call any educator out because I'm very guilty of this as well. I think it could also be a representation of our bias, right? Like depending on which students are coming up in our data, oftentimes, I often think if we're removing students from our data, then I think that can lead to harmful stereotyping and more bias, right? And so I think it's important for us to make sure that we are paying attention to that. So while there might be accountability, right, coming from above us, it's important for us as educators to hold ourselves accountable to examining our bias, right? And really looking at school-wide data to be able to ensure, do we have an equity issue, right, within our data? And how can we address this as a group of educators who care about kids together so that we can make sure that it's not just, I guess, placing blame on the kids. Like this is a student problem, right? Instead, it's what are we doing and what can we do to improve our own behavior and also our own environment at the same time as getting kids what they need to be successful too.
Mary, that really reminds me of one of the foundational things that I've always talked about with PBIS is that changing kid behavior is really about changing adult behavior, right? And so that's
yeah, definitely
harder to do, but that's what it takes.
So when Danielle and I were preparing for our conversation today, we came up with this question and we were like, so if the assumption is that students are skewing our data and we're here to say that they're not skewing our data, well, then what are they doing? And Danielle was so great. She was like, they're coming to school.
They're showing up as their authentic selves and all that brings. Like, yeah, the same way we do to work. And sometimes we spill coffee.
Yeah. It means that they came to school. Yeah. It means that we noticed a behavior. It means that we documented that behavior. And it means that it's possible that our systems aren't supporting them in the way that they need to be supported. So they may need something additional, or we may need to change something about what it is that we're doing. So it's like so fundamental, right? That we can get into these more in-depth conversations about, so what do we do about it? But when she pointed it out, I was like, well, duh. Like, yeah. Kids are they're coming to school. Like that's what they're doing. Yeah. They're showing up and they're behaving and doing things the way that they would do them based on the systems that we have in place. So as you're looking at your data and you're thinking about whether you're going to work towards solving it as a school-wide, at a systemic level, or you're starting to notice that you have maybe a handful of students and you want to choose a more targeted or individualized approach. How do you know which one it is that you're working with and where you go from there?
Yeah. So I know you said as you're looking at your data, but that's not always a common practice within schools. And so,
okay, great.
So I want to just call that out a little bit because
great, let's do it.
We've worked with a lot of schools who don't use data and it's not their fault. Maybe their data systems aren't as effective or efficient, right? There's lots of issues that come along with looking at data. But the first thing is, one, you should be looking at data at every team meeting because without it, it's just our own opinions of what might be going on, which I think makes sense because I remember when I was a school counselor, there would be times where I was lucky enough that I had lots of conversations with adults throughout the day. But as a teacher, I would get teachers who would come into my office during their lunch or after school, and it would be like we'd be together for a whole hour just talking about some of the issues that happen throughout the day and how we can support them. So sometimes it's an adult's first time or a teacher's first time talking to an adult about their experiences throughout the day.
Mm-hmm.
But when we actually use data, we have a good starting point to solve problems that are being reported versus our opinions. And when we don't use data, when we just rely on opinions, then we run into lots of problem-solving issues, like our bias can come into play. We see problem admiration, right? Where we're just maybe solving the same problem over and over and over again. And that's actually not being solved. We're just talking about it a lot.
Oh, it's one of my favorite things to do in a meeting.
Yeah, just solve it. Yeah, like, at the beginning of the year, you started talking about issues on the playground. It's like at the spring, why have we still not solved this problem?
Yeah. The talking about it feels good though, right? And I think that to your point, it's important to make space for that. But it can go on and on and on and on and on. And then you get into it, it becomes a thing that you're talking about that never really, that wasn't what you started to discuss in the first place. And data really help to root us in the purpose and like what it is that we're trying to do here.
Yeah. And like you said, talking about it does feel good, right? Like it's pretty therapeutic sometimes, but it can also lead to, like I said, problem admiration, and that gets frustrating for everyone.
For everybody.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So I just feel like too, when we don't come up with solutions, then people get mad, and we're not helping kids in that way. So I think it's really important. One, view your data. And when it comes to determining if it's a school-wide or a targeted or individual issue, oftentimes I like to follow the 10% rule. So if you have more than 10% of your student population who are reporting to have this same issue, then we know that it's more of a systemic or a systems issue. We need to look at what's going on in our environment. What are we doing as the adults that might be contributing to this? And how can we shift things in our system around to see if we can get some improvement? If it's 10% or less of students, then I might then jump to targeted, right? Like maybe it's a small group of students, for example, fourth graders on the playground at this time, where we might need to implement a class-wide intervention or a small group intervention. And then same with individual too. But always starting with what percent of students are really engaging in this issue to kind of determine what level of intervention we need.
Such a good decision rule that you're talking about there. It's something that we've talked about too as an organization, just helping teams navigate once you said, once you are looking at your data, what is it that how do you start, where do you start, and these decision rules can really help teams focus on those first points of their decision-making process, for sure.
I've seen that for sure too in teams. And I like that Mary brought up how not all teams are great at looking at data or even do, because sometimes they feel like, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with this information. And so I think so much of that comes not at the meeting, but in the work that goes into setting up your meetings and building your team and creating decision rules, roles and responsibilities. Like all of that kind of helps that meeting be more efficient when you can say, here's our data, here's our decision rules. Now we can kind of design solutions that we can implement with some level of fidelity.
Yeah. And that's not the sexy part of PBIS, right? No one wants to be working on teaming, roles and responsibilities. What are our values as a team? What's our team purpose? What problem-solving process are we going to follow? To me, the most success I've seen in teams are teams that have put in the work to do that, because then they've gotten really good at looking at data. People come really prepared to the meetings, right? They have data that they can look at in a readable and digestible way. And then they have a problem-solving process that they can follow to essentially help avoid going from problem straight to solution, which I think we think is a good, efficient way of solving problems, but it's oftentimes we're doing it too quickly. We're not looking at all of the pieces that go into identifying what's the function of this behavior, what support might be best for this function. And so I think the teams who put that work in at the beginning, even though it's not the most fun or exciting, usually those are the teams we see most success with.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree with that. I've worked with lots of schools too, Mary, and it's more fun to sometimes be like, let's plan the big assembly, or let's, talk about how we're going to do, a acknowledgement blitz. And they're more fun. But I agree. It's those foundational things to set up how are we going to work together that really move the dial.
Rayann, we heard you talk about purpose and establishing your purpose as a team. Can you talk a little bit about more about that, like what you mean by it and how that helps to really center the work around decision making?
Yeah, I was just thinking that teams will solve whatever problem they're set out to solve. And we do a lot of work around universal screening. And oftentimes in that very first meeting, we'll get questions like, so does this help us get kids to special education? And it's, where the mindset is there. And so if we define our purpose from the very beginning and constantly revisit that, maybe it's part of your norms, vision, and just you start every meeting off, we are here to look at school-wide data. Here's our process for looking at small group data and individual data. It just, I think, sets the tone and is a nice reminder.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Love that. So think about teams you've worked with. Are there ever times when they might ask, so we're going to look at our school-wide data, but should we just take a few kids out? Should we, what would be the harm in excluding a couple or a group of kids as we're looking at that data? How do you help teams navigate that question?
Well, I think going back to talking about how these are actual humans, right? These are kids behind the data. And so even though when it can be easy to get caught up in just that, like forgetting that there's students behind these numbers, and the harm in taking them out of our data analysis is that we are excluding them. So it might not be, exclusion to where we think exclusionary discipline practices, which has its own set of negative outcomes, right? But we're still removing people from our community. And everyone wants to be part of the community until they're not. And if we are intentionally taking them out of our community and saying, oh, well, this student has an IEP, or we're already working with the student, we're not actually saying, well, what is it? Is our school-wide system working for all, right? Because we've already removed some from our all. And so we want to make sure that we're helping kids get their needs met, and we're constantly looking at whether or not the supports that we're putting in place are meeting all of their needs. Otherwise, essentially, we're letting kids fall through the cracks. And I know that we don't do that intentionally, but those are kind of that's kind of the harm that comes with it when we take kids out of our data. And we have had teams who have asked, like, can the student's getting an IEP, can we remove them from our data? And we've kind of had to have our discussions about it, specifically starting with admin, like saying, when we do this, here's the harm that comes with it. And here's how, even if there's, like you had said, the myth is skewing our data, even if these students are, in quotes, skewing our data, actually they're not. They're coming, right, addressing that myth and saying they're showing up to school as their authentic self, and having the tough conversation of, we need to continuously look at what we're doing to provide the right, successful supports for them.
I'm wondering too, we've talked to a few folks this year, and a couple of them have mentioned the role that social workers play. And last month, there was this idea shared that what if we added social workers to our school-wide team? And so I guess what I'm kind of throwing around in my own brain a little bit is, I'm thinking, trying to put myself in the shoes of a school-wide team member, and I'm looking at our data, and I know that there are a group of students that we have referred for or are participating in some additional support, right? And they have a team that's looking at those data and how successful they are, and they might be looking at behavior patterns also for that particular group of students. Are there times when those teams then share outcomes of those additional supports with the school-wide team so that there can be a better assessment made on whether or not the tier 1 systems and practices that you have in place are actually working for those students, without making the assumption that any additional behavior we see is being addressed by the targeted or individualized supports that they're receiving? Is there ever like a back and forth between these teams where they can kind of problem solve together?
I think that we would offer that if there is a school social worker, they should absolutely be on the team. Washington has a fantastic document that all of our professional associations, ESAs, whatever, that Education Services Associate or something, they all came together and defined what are our roles within the 3 tiers. And school social workers have their own column, and what should they be doing to actualize their expertise within tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And so it offers some things like providing professional development to staff on restorative practices and culturally sustaining strategies, leading parent groups, and I'm happy to share that with you. But it is a phenomenal document.
Yeah,
And
I'd love to see.
We'd love to see it.
yeah, whoever does have a school social worker should be very grateful, because I just pulled data last week around the ratio of school social workers to students. And in Washington, it was like 4,800 students per one social worker.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. What do you do? So, okay, you see those data, you see that, and then you go, huh, what do we do?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, and
what-
every
what
state's
is to
different.
be-
That's Washington.
Yeah.
What does Oregon look like? What does
I would be
Georgia look
curious
like? Yeah.
to know, like, across different states what that looks like. But if that's like, let's say that's it's a similar ratio, let's say here in Oregon or in another state, like, what do you do with that? What do you do with that when you know that the skill set that comes and the information that comes with a role like that is so helpful to individual schools as well as individual kids? So, like, what do you do with that?
So when I looked at it, I was a little bit alarmed. And then I was like, maybe I need to unpack it
Yeah.
a little bit. That doesn't feel like what I see. Now, do I think that there's enough school social workers? No, I don't.
Never.
But I know that there is not funding attached oftentimes to that role.
Okay.
And so I have seen some districts do some creative things, like convert their school social workers to a family liaison,
I
which
see.
is still a school social worker.
Gotcha.
Now, I don't know if that would show up
In those
on
data
the
you
U.S. Department of Education's, civil rights data as a school social worker. I don't know. So it could be accurate. It could be skewed based off of, creative adaptations to
Yep.
people's role abilities. But
yeah.
I forgot the question. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Like, what do you do
Yeah.
when you know that the need is greater than the people who can fill it? And also, if, let's say, you don't have access to a social worker, but you do have advanced tiers and teams that are looking at those data, what are the ways that we can include those teams, like the overlap and the communication that happens between those two teams, to ensure that I, as a school-wide team member, am not looking at Mary's data in my school-wide reports going, she just keeps showing up in our stuff. And if we could, I need to make a decision about the school-wide stuff, and Mary just keeps pushing kids on the playground. And I don't know if I have a playground issue or if I have a Mary issue. I don't know. And I guess what I'm just trying to figure out is, like, there needs to be communication across these teams that are working with individual kids and teams that are looking at systemic school-wide data. And I'm not sure how that happens, just in my own little bubble.
I think that, from what I have seen, it's important that we take, I guess, inventory of our team. So looking at who's represented on the tier 1 and then who's represented on the advanced tier, and making sure that we have common people. So it's not that every person on the tier 1 team needs to sit on the tier 2 and tier 3 team, but there needs to be a common person where communication is being shared. And then I think it's still important. One, our tier 1 team should be sharing out, right? Like, what are the outcomes we're seeing because of our tier 1 or school-wide efforts with all staff? And I think that having systems where your advanced tier team is sharing that with the tier 1 team, maybe we don't share it with the entire staff, but instead we have someone who kind of takes the lead, or as I like to have a role on the team that's like the staff or the team communicator. And that person is the one who kind of shares back and forth. Like, we have Mary on our radar. We have a system in place. We have an intervention in place, and we're progress monitoring. We're going to come back to looking at Mary's data in 2 weeks. And so we'll keep you updated. But there needs to be a role, one that's defined for that, and then someone who kind of sits on both teams. Oftentimes I see that as the school counselor or maybe a school psych who's sitting on your team who kind of plays that role.
Got it.
I love how Mary's always bringing us back here again to the work that does to create strong teams, right? To help decide how we're going to function together. Yeah. I'd also probably add, the role of an administrator. And we know from research that, to have interventions and school-wide supports really be the most effective and most likely to sustain, having an actively involved administrator is super critical. And so I feel like they can also help as they see that whole school purview of what teams are operating and making sure there's communication going on.
Yeah.
Love it.
Mm-hmm.
I'd add on also, oftentimes we see the data kind of just flies past the tier 1 team and goes straight to tier 2 team. So having those documented data decision rules, processes, this is who looks at it first. Oftentimes we see like a flow chart, just to help people remember this is how we look at data. These are how we make our decisions. Helpful.
Great.
So as we're talking to our audience and they're starting to think about their teams and the data that they're familiar with, if they are familiar with their data, what is it that you would recommend as some first steps toward addressing this idea that all means all, and when you know that there are a handful of students that maybe are or fewer than 10% of your students that are receiving those additional supports, how do you include those students in your decision making as a school-wide team? What are some of those steps that you might recommend in their process?
So I think we've said a lot data decision rules, right? But not every team has those in place. And that's a key step to take, is what are the decision rules that we are going to look at, right? To help us say, one, is it more than 10% or less than 10%? And then looking at specifically, what is it that qualifies a student from moving from this tier 1 to support to needing a tier 2 and tier 3 support? And that could be, maybe it's that we see a certain number of attendance, right, issues. Maybe we also see some office discipline referral data. Maybe they're coming up as showing some risk in our screening data. But we're really taking this whole child approach where we're looking at multiple data sources. And then we as a team have decided these data points or these data decision rules are going to say, this is when we need to start looking at a tier 2 or a tier 3 support for a student. And then I think in order to do that, you first, I guess I'm working backwards. You first need to have kind of this inventory of interventions. What are the things that we have in place that we can provide at the tier 1 level? Or what outcomes are we seeing with it? Are they effective, right? And are we implementing them well? Because sometimes we can have a large number of students come up as needing tier 2 and tier 3 supports because of an implementation issue at tier 1. So maybe we're not, maybe we're implementing several different tier 1 initiatives and it's kind of diluted the effectiveness of them. And so one, always looking at fidelity at tier 1. And then with those decision rules saying, okay, our tier 1 is strong, and now we have these data that say that this handful of kids still need tier 2 and tier 3 support. So we're going to look at these other data points, like I said, attendance, office discipline referrals, screening data, to see what more they might need.
As you asked the question, I was thinking about just checking for student voice on the team.
Yes.
They are so beyond helpful in validating our solutions, helping us to define our hypotheses, how we are modifying our supports and interventions. They know more about what they need sometimes than we do. And in addition to that, just like the family voice. And I think we get really nervous to bring in families because we feel like we have to have things right or going to be evaluated. That is another topic for another day, but having those partners, at the table will be huge in helping you stay focused and making sure you're solving the right problem, the right time, right people.
I love that, Rayann. Thanks for advocating for student voice. I'm with you in that. And I feel like, the students are the ones experiencing school. So to hear from them more frequently about how that's working and what might serve them better is, I think, critical.
Yeah, one of the districts we work with took TIPS, team initiated problem solving, and created a student version of it. And it has student roles in there and how the student then takes the data and like checks it with their peer group. Like, this is what they want to do to solve this, or this is what we want to do to solve this problem, and validates it or edits it and brings it back. And I love it so much.
We would love to get a copy of that and share it with our listeners if possible.
Yeah, I will do that.
Please do.
Danielle is always advocating on behalf of asking students what they need instead of guessing. And it just gets back to this whole thing that we've been talking about today, which is that your data are one part of the process, and it's important to use them effectively and to have them kind of guide you through your conversation, but that you always have to check on like what could be contributing, the function of the behavior, the motivation, and then the assumptions that you bring to the table as an adult are not necessarily the things that students are thinking about in that context. And so asking those questions, getting family members to be involved, updating the systems and the practices that you've got in place based on what works for your school-wide community, I think is always something that we would advocate for. And it's so nice to hear you all say those same things with the schools that you guys work with too. It's just affirming, you know? Well, we appreciate having you guys here and joining us today on this episode. I think that we've busted this myth that students don't skew our data. They are part of the data and need to be addressed as the human beings that they are and the full members of our school-wide community that they are. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.